So here we are, another Pokemon Day came and went, and while I think it was amongst the strongest of them with the more streamlined approach to smaller updates and more importantly, the reveal of Pokemon Legends ZA, I have some thoughts, comments, and concerns I gotta rant about for a bit. Really just about the latter. First of all, we're obviously in early days. We don't know much about Pokemon Legends ZA, so this could all be wrong and age poorly, but that doesn't have to mean this video needs to be a flash in the pan. Worst case scenario, I want this video to serve as a time capsule, as it were. So in 2025 and beyond, if you're watching this video, first of all, subscribe. Second of all, please leave in the comments what new info made this video dated or flat out wrong in whatever way. I'd love to compare and contrast in a what I got wrong video when the game comes out. Okay, so my problem with Pokemon Legends ZA is entirely owed to my experience with Pokemon Legends Arceus. Something I want more than most things is a Pokemon game with a more modern battle system and overall more engaging gameplay loop. So when I initially saw Legends Arceus's official reveal, I thought I was potentially in for my favorite Pokemon game of all time. That didn't happen. The gist of my feelings for that game are it was really fun and exciting to play for the first 2/3 or so of the campaign, at which point the scenes began to show vividly, and that last third became a slog to get through. The battle system is poorly balanced since the AI can essentially circumvent the advantages of going with agile or strike styles. The insane number of Pokemon that can attack you in hordes as a means to increased challenge was misguided and led to a much more frustrating game than a challenging one. The boss battles were poorly executed and riddled with issues like poor hit detection. Bosses can frame trap you, and they just overall feel like boss battles from the PS1 era in all of the worst ways. The ability to catch Pokemon in the overworld without having to engage in battle was fun throughout my playthrough, but the novelty of that is not strong enough to carry an entire game. As a lifelong Pokemon fan that has put hundreds of hours into every major Pokemon release up until this point, that really soured the overall experience for me. Now, I don't necessarily hate Legends Arceus. I walked away from it with the thought that, as a proof of concept experiment that can be built into and iterated on in more fully featured Pokemon games in the core series, potentially leading to a monumental shift in what Pokemon is quality-wise, it was worth making and thereby experiencing. In other words, it was a cool tech demo for gameplay and quality of life improvements that I hope eventually find themselves implemented into the current formula. And that's because, for all of its faults, there's a reason why so many continue to buy into each Pokemon generation despite the negativity surrounding the franchise's modern releases, and that's the formula they continue to build onto is prime for a world and fan base as varied as Pokemon. Typically, Pokemon games consistently are more entertaining the further in you get, not less. And that's true even if you cut the experience short and never dive into any post-game activities, team building, player battles, end-game events or facilities, shiny hunting, the list goes on. I'll go into this a bit more later, but I pointed out here to contrast it with Arceus, which plateaus and falls off and is eventually best served as a memory. That's a massive downgrade. So when everyone speculated about the potential for a Pokemon Legends Kyurem or whatever, I was very down on the idea for two major reasons. The first is admittedly more of an assumption than anything that Game Freak can barely maintain the main franchise's growth, so expecting them to maintain the full featured Pokemon games and a series of Legends games doesn't seem to be the smartest idea. The second and personally harder to reconcile reason is that nothing in me wants to play a game like Legends Arceus ever again. There's a few ways people try to dismiss this perspective that I want to talk about here to better frame how I feel about this and potentially Legends ZA. The most popular response is not every game needs to be 100 plus hours. And while I agree with the face of this statement, provided the sentiment, this take is reductive and misconstrues the initial complaint. No one that plays Pokemon games for as long as they do does so because it's required of them or even something they require of the game. This isn't a Final Fantasy game. You can be in and out of most Pokemon games in under 30 hours. This is something I love about them, contrary to how I tend to to play them. They give the player the flexibility to play how and for how long they want to play. Contrast that with a game like Legends Arceus, where not only are you limited to a smaller game in terms of content, how you experience that content is limited as a result. In my experience, the people that really embrace the idea of smaller scale Pokemon games tend to be people who already play Pokemon games for a shorter amount of time. Something Pokemon games have facilitated from the very beginning and haven't wavered on doing since. The suggestion that people who play Pokemon games for more than just the base campaign should be okay with a game that doesn't allow for the way they play at all, just because it still accommodates those who don't play Pokemon for all or even just more of what it is ridiculous, to put it lightly. The best part of Pokemon games is that if you feel like you don't want to put 100 hours into it, you don't have to, and you can still feel fulfilled with the experience. What sucks about Arceus is there isn't enough content to make that a fun thing to do, and therefore you don't even have that agency. On the other end of that spectrum, when I play Pokemon campaigns, I don't catch every Pokemon I see. I catch the Pokemon I like and want to use. With Arceus, you literally have to catch Pokemon to progress through the game. Another example of Arceus taking a series that champions freedom and using it to force the player to catch for the sake of catching. They didn't even force you to catch Pokemon in the first Pokemon games, and their tagline was literally "gotta catch 'em all." While these days I tend to complete my Pokedex as soon as possible, I do it as an ancillary reward-based activity while playing with friends, not as the end goal. And even if there wasn't concrete walls blocking your progress behind a certain number of Pokemon caught, hindering you from just catching Pokemon you want to catch, Arceus made team building stupid while playing through the game as well, because to beat the game, again, you have to catch and subsequently use every Pokemon to check all of the arbitrary boxes. And for the people that argue in bad faith that this should be okay because it's the point of Pokemon, ignoring the fact that catching them all hasn't been the point even in marketing for well over a decade, would you be okay with the inverse of that? After all, competitive has very clearly become much more of Pokemon Company's focus and promotional efforts in the modern era. What if this game forced you to do VGC battles? Would this argument still hold water to you? I doubt it heavily. Pokemon is about exploring, catching, training, trading, and battling. None of that in isolation has been a requirement to find enjoyment in the game up until now. So Legends Arceus making that the case for someone that has always loved the ability to play how I want for as long as I want is disappointing. And if they don't rectify this problem with the next Legends game, that would be really upsetting. Finally, there's the common sentiment that since Pokemon games have fallen short on a technical level this console generation, that the solution is to scale down, and therefore a game like Legends Arceus is the perfect solution. I disagree with this sentiment wholeheartedly. While I think Pokemon fans on social media go overboard with the whole Pokemon is the biggest media brand in the world thing, I do think that fact in isolation should mean that they strive to improve, not to regress. Given Pokemon's current state, it would take some restructuring, but as a consumer, I think it's reasonable to expect them to take those steps, just not in the way the vocal minority tends to go about it. I think just making more small games that are targeted at verticals of the franchise is a bad way to achieve this. Pokemon could absolutely take the Rockstar route and instead use whatever small games they do make as a means to learn about ways to improve the main product, rather than segmenting off certain changes as a means to establish spin-offs or whatever. People are pretending that some sort of alternating 3-year schedule of mainline game into DLC into Legends game would alleviate the overall work, but in reality, with the way Game Freak has approached this, all they really did was weaken each individual product in the process. It's painfully obvious that these affect each other if you just look to the timeline of these games' releases. Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl clearly launched months behind schedule. Same for Legends Arceus, as evidenced by the obvious connection Gen 4's anniversary was supposed to play into the release of BDSP, combined with the fact that no entertainment brand on the planet would choose to release their product over a month after the holiday season. A similar conclusion can be drawn with Pokémon Scarlet and Violet if you just look at the content of the DLC. Do you really think they intended to release DLC themed around a summer festival in September? How about a horror themed epilogue in the middle of January? Because I sure don't. Alternatively, I'd much prefer a world where we didn't even get Legends Arceus and all or even most of its gameplay mechanics found its way into Gen 9 instead. But since they were being developed simultaneously by different teams, the good ideas either team contributed to their games couldn't carry over to both. Scarlet and Violet is full stop a better game than Arceus, not only for the fact that it's more content complete, but also for the fact that it's infinitely more scalable. In other words, assuming they implemented the gameplay mechanics of Arceus like the overworld stealth or catching mechanics into Scarlet, everything else could have neatly found itself inside of Gen 9 as DLC or expansions of some sort. The same couldn't be said the other way around. The only thing holding Scarlet and Violet back in comparison is its technical issues, and I don't think it's crazy to suggest that were they not juggling 2 games while supporting a third at the same time would not have been the case. Game Freak is a studio that needs support to make games of this caliber, not one that should be providing it for one, again, let alone for the 3 they released. Also, I mean, let's not forget, Arceus isn't exactly a technical marvel. Revisionist history may lead you to forgetting, but people weren't exactly thrilled with this performance either. That's not to say its value is confined to just being a conduit for more engaging gameplay. Having a playable window into the history of the Pokemon world is cool, but I'd much rather that be through DLC for a full mainline game than through a full-on $60 release that pales in comparison on the content front. But that's a different conversation for a different time. So again, subscribe if you'd want to hear more on that topic in particular. With all of that in mind, I do have some level of excitement for Legends ZA, and as I'm sure you can gather, it's because I think there's a strong possibility that it won't be like Legends Arceus in all of the ways that matter most. The setting of Legends Arceus being in the early days of humans and Pokemon forming the relationships we know the series for is responsible for the vast majority of problems I have with Arceus. The Pokédex feels redundant and overly centralized because of the rudimentary nature and the subsequent need to go on the redundant goose chase for copious amounts of every Pokemon attainable in the game. The lack of in-game trainer battles and or any type of meaningful multiplayer experiences can be explained away by the general fear humanity has of Pokemon in this era, leading to a lack of people that want to catch, train, trade, or battle with Pokemon. The inability to use more than one Pokemon at a time, even in battles that consist of much more than the standard 2 on the opposing side, can even be chalked up to the same unfamiliarity with Pokemon training, and therefore the player character's inability to command more than one Pokemon in battle at a time. Legends ZA seems to veer away from this at least a little if the announcement trailer is anything to go by. There are multiple depictions of the more modern way we currently engage with Pokemon in traditional Pokemon games. Multiple Pokemon are seen with trainers, and there's even a shot of a trainer battle, albeit still single battle, being held in the city, which is promising. I think a world of Pokemon that are unfamiliar with Pokemon has proven to be a less enjoyable experience in terms of what that dynamic contributes to the structure of the game. But assuming Legends ZA takes place in the future, like it appears to, that's something we shouldn't have to worry about, even if the game only enters that time frame toward the end, provided they seize that opportunity to include coinciding game modes like trainer battles and raids of some sort that can keep the game alive after rolling credits. And I will be okay with that, as it's not too dissimilar to what we've been used to. I would prefer the former scenario where we can enjoy that option throughout the entire experience, but I'll take what I can get to improve Legends games moving forward. And there are a few things Legends ZA does remove from potentially undoing damage I think Arceus did to the formula. Despite many people in the competitive community's disdain for the mechanic, I am excited to see the return of Mega Evolution, and am curious to see what Pokemon they decide to give the honor of receiving their own. As a Charizard enthusiast myself, I welcome our Mega Charizard Z overlords with open arms. In fact, I'm so excited for this mechanic, I want to make a video for Mega Evolutions I want to see added from every generation. I'll do that next so I can make a purely positive video about Legends ZA, because despite my issues with the Now series, I am looking forward to playing it, believe it or not. Thank you to Redirect's first ever executive producer, Trev L. Steinberg, and all of these other great names you see scrolling on the screen for keeping this channel afloat. If you'd like to join them and get other cool perks like exclusive content, access to community events, Pokemon themed merch, you can find all of that and more at shop.watchredirect.com. Linked in the description. Or the best way to support, subscribe and ring the bell to be notified whenever new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next video.